The story of waste is as old as mankind itself. Even our Stone Age forebears created impressive amounts of waste, and each cultural development brought with it an increase in the amount of rubbish produced. Yet reuse always took precedence over outright disposal. With industrialization, however, this changed.
We have developed a culture of waste and throw away rather than reuse.
We have deposited our rubbish in the most far-flung corners of the earth. How did that happen? Is mankind doomed to litter?
The challenge we have today, we are trying to retrain our culture to say, can we recycle? Can we reuse? Can we be the custodians of our environment rather than the destroyers of our environment?
In nature, nothing goes to waste. Rubbish only appeared with human beings. When our forebears first walked upright, they suddenly had both hands free. Free to create and use tools, but also to throw away things that were broken or no longer useful. That's what we call rubbish or waste.
Rubbish is not a modern phenomenon. Rubbish has been with man right from the start. A human has to eat, and in order to be able to eat, waste is created in the processing of the resources. Whether it's animals or plants, the human produces something he needs daily in the form of tools and equipment, and here too, waste is produced.
Our ancestors' rubbish is now on show in museums. Discarded flintstones, hand axes or arrowheads. Every refuse mound makes our forebears' history more tangible. In fact, history was mainly documented through their waste.
Archaeologists learn from rubbish. From the objects themselves, they learn about production processes. They learn about the raw materials available to people, what they made from them, how they made things. We learn what they lived off, which animals they kept, what plants were cultivated, and we can reconstruct all that from rubbish.
Excavations of Stone Age campsites call into question the waste-free image we have of our early ancestors. In Lower Saxony, on a 9th century campsite, some 13,000 stone objects were found. Work tools, arrowheads, but above all, production waste, scattered haphazardly over an area of just 100 square meters. Our ancestors evidently lived amidst their waste, although it was much more than just rubbish. Experimental archaeologist Wolf Hein made a precise reconstruction based on artifacts and his own experience working with flintstone. The decision as to whether something from the Stone Age is rubbish or not is generally based on whether it could possibly have been used again in some way.
Here we have the so-called social decline of a flint blade. I chipped this blade off a stone core. At that point, the edge is sharp. I could cut meat with it, or leather. When it gets blunt, it has a kind of sawtooth edge. It's good for use as a rasp or to carve wood, or work on ivory or horn. Once it becomes too blunt for that, it can be turned into a so-called scraper. I can use it to scrape leather or skins. And when it gets too blunt, even for that, it becomes a projectile. I can throw it at a dog.
Made laboriously by hand, most things were too valuable just to be casually discarded. They were recycled.
We have evidence from the Paleolithic age of the recycling and repair of objects. For example, bone needles. It takes 2.5 hours to make a bone needle. That's quite a lot of work. That's why, if it was broken, it was either sharpened again, or if the eye was broken, a new eye was drilled into it. And only when it couldn't be held at all was it thrown away. This is basically evidence of recycling as early as the Paleolithic age.
Recycling is by no means a modern-day concept. It's as old as waste creation itself. The little that was left lying around in the Stone Age didn't bother anyone because there were very few people, and they just moved on. If they ever did come back, nature would have consumed the rubbish. This system worked for millennia until human beings began to settle. Denmark, on the Limfjord in North Jutland, Ertebølle. The coastal areas dotted everywhere with long, narrow hills covered with grass. In the mid-19th century, they were investigated archaeologically for the first time, revealing an astonishing fact. The hills were actually prehistoric rubbish dumps, so-called køkkenmødding, dating back to the 6th millennium BCE. The folk who had spent the winter in the shelter of the forest came to the sea in spring to fill up on the food that they could just gather along the beach. There was an enormous supply of shellfish, mussels, cockles, oysters, and winkles. Protein-rich sustenance that people desperately needed after the deprivations of winter. But unlike other food waste that perishes over time, seashells are different. Because they're made of lime, they remained permanently piled up in the landscape, in køkkenmødding, or kitchen middens. Neolithic age families set up home on them, and with every meal they added more shells, and the mountains accumulated. Today, there are still huge numbers of oyster shells along the beach at Ertebølle. Archaeologists estimate no fewer than 20 million in a stretch of around 140 meters.
At that time, people settled in this bay in a spot from where it was easiest to reach the whole fishing grounds. Everyone stayed at their spot. And on this spot, you ate your food and then just chucked the empty shell behind you. And that's how this heap was created. First, it was just a small pile, maybe one per family. And then those piles grew into one big heap.
A process that took around 1,500 years. And the excavations had more surprises in store. Human bones were found in the middens. The dead had not simply been thrown away, but ceremoniously buried, as researchers deduced from the grave goods they found. A grave among the rubbish. What might today be considered degrading was definitely not so back then. A man-made hillock, perhaps it was even viewed with reverence. At any rate, it seemed a worthy place for the dead to be interred.
Today we bury our dead right next to the church, as close as possible to the town where we live. And it must have been the same back then. They buried their dead directly where they lived, namely in the heaps they lived on. They were everything. It was their house, their home, their territory. And it was their burial place. Basically, their whole life was lived here, in all its complexity.
Life on these prehistoric rubbish dumps dates to a cultural transition period. People were not yet entirely settled, but when food resources dried up, they moved on to new fishing grounds and mussel beds, and began to accumulate the next mountain of shells there. It was with urban living that rubbish first became a real problem, as an example from Turkey demonstrates impressively. Çatalhöyük, the first large settlement in history. Around 7000 BCE, it was already home to several thousand people living close together in houses that were only accessible via the rooftops. All the rubbish that accumulated ended up in the narrow spaces between the houses and under the living quarters. Leftover food, feces, even corpses. A hygiene disaster.
So there was a crisis, and it was a crisis that was effectively the challenge for the whole world about how would major cities grow in the future? How could people live together in such profusion? How would you solve it? You do need major interventions. You do need investment in infrastructure. You do need to protect the health of people with deploying science as well as engineering. So these are all very important principles.
Principles that, with the triumph of urban culture, became a matter of survival. This is still evident today in studies of the ruins of ancient Rome, the world's first multi-million city. Here, as in other ancient metropolises, a river was used to flush away the masses of waste and feces that accumulated daily. But for the waste to be removed from the city and into the river at all, a sewage system was needed, like the Roman cloaca maxima. Originally designed as an open canal, it was gradually built over and covered up. This was the only way the construction could fulfill its purpose: to banish the stench of sewage, which even then was blamed for causing diseases, from public places.
They used their common sense, and their common sense said it must be the smell in the air. We can smell all the filthy smells of our ordure, of our excrement, of our urine that is in the water and in the gutters. And so they decided it must be miasma. They called that the way it spreads through the air. That's what miasma means. It's like a cloud in the air.
To combat the foul-smelling cloud over the city, Rome took numerous measures. The first was a sophisticated fresh water supply. It was brought in every day over hundreds of kilometers from the surrounding mountains by long-distance pipelines. The precious commodity was collected first in large distribution basins, the Castella Divisorum, and then transported according to a prioritized system, depending on the water levels. The lowest pipe supplied the public fountains and was always flowing. The top one dried up when the water level was low, affecting private dwellings. In between were the thermal baths and public toilets that were flushed by a constant flow of water. Public latrines were built all over Rome. They were regarded as the most progressive measure against the miasma. However, the sponges attached to sticks were used by everyone to clean themselves off. From today's point of view, not only an aesthetic, but also a hygiene issue. Still, the bad odors disappeared from the city, were flushed away into the cloaca maxima. The term cloaca for a sewage system has survived until today. What is special about the Roman cloaca is that it is still an active sewer, although the environment is contaminated. This poses a special challenge for researchers and is the reason why the entire course of the cloaca maxima has not been reconstructed to this day.
There are many canals that have not yet been excavated, so we don't know where they lead. What we suspect is that this most populous part of Rome was served by only 3 sewage pipes. The cloaca maxima in the center, the cloaca Circi towards the Colosseum, and the Chiavicone del Olmo towards Campo Marzio. These 3 large sewage pipes basically constituted the sewage system for the whole of Rome.
Research is always facing setbacks because they keep finding passageways that had lain buried under rubble or been blocked, and that reveal new, surprising facts. Below ground, but also above it. Because the history of the Cloaca Maxima reflects the construction history of Rome. If anything is modified underground, something up above has to be adapted to it, and vice versa.
And everything was dug up and diverted and so on. So there were many people who resented it. We have an acronym for this, NIMBY, and it stands for Not in My Backyard. And if you look at any major development in civilization, you will find NIMBYs. From Roman times through to modern times, you will find NIMBYs who say, oh yes, I think it's a good idea, but not here, not here.
No one wanted this mountain anywhere near them either. Monte Testaccio. Rome's 8th hill is not a natural one. Underneath the surface is an ancient rubbish dump made up of millions of broken amphorae. Amphorae were the standard containers for transporting liquid and semi-liquid foodstuffs in ancient times. These ceramic containers made life in Rome possible in the first place because the many citizens in this city of over 1 million inhabitants could no longer provide for themselves. They depended not only on kilometre-long drinking water pipes, but also on imported foods. These goods had to be packaged for the long journey to Rome. Mankind needs packaging. Even in the Stone Age, they used boxes made of birch bark. After 3 to 4 uses, rubbish. In the Neolithic age, people began to weave baskets, but they were not suitable for early farmers who had to store milk and stockpile provisions. The solution was a momentous discovery. Clay, when fired, becomes hard and durable. Ceramic. The material was the preferred packaging for everyday use, together with other discoveries, barrels made of wooden staves, glass, metal, or paper. Only plastic packaging would come to outstrip ceramic. Goods destined for Rome reached the cargo port of Emporium via the river Tiber. Extensive ruins still bear witness to the importance of this place today. Since the 2nd century BCE, huge warehouses called Porticus Aemilia were built here as a temporary storage place for the countless amphorae that arrived here from all over the world. But ceramic has one decided disadvantage. If it breaks, it's rubbish. And that landed up on the Monte Testaccio. At first, researchers were puzzled. So many amphorae, broken by accident? But excavations in the 1870s provided some answers.
Amphorae were classified into different types, as our bottles are today. There were some for wine, another kind for beer, for example. In ancient Rome, there were many different kinds. At the end of the 19th century, German-Italian Heinrich Stressel carried out the first systematic study of Roman amphorae and created a classification. He gave every type of amphora a number, and the oil amphora from southern Spain was given the number 20. So we talk about the amphora Dressel 20.
Dressel 20. In ancient times, this amphora was used mainly to transport oily fish sauce, garum, which was used by the Romans in enormous quantities. However, vessels that had previously held garum could no longer be used for other foodstuffs because of its strong, lingering odor.
These amphorae were one-way containers. When they arrived at their destination, they were destroyed, because it was easier to make a new one than to return an empty one to its place of origin.
Because ceramic was cheap, it became the first non-returnable packaging, a stroke of luck for archaeologists.
The lucky thing about Testaccio is that all the inscriptions on the amphorae are preserved here. Not only the stamps of the place of origin, but also the notes that the Romans wrote on the amphorae. The net weight, the full weight of the contents of the amphora, the name of the merchant. So for us, this place is the best archive of the economic history of the ancient world, because of these inscriptions that we find here. In other places, we don't have that.
It is estimated that around 53 million amphorae were deposited on Monte Testaccio over the course of 260 years. But if these are almost all oil amphorae, what happened to the others? Recent excavations in the immediate vicinity of Testaccio have provided some fascinating insights. Where today there's a shopping arcade, in ancient times this place was already filled with merchant stalls, albeit 6 meters below today's street level. A marketplace for used amphorae, an antique recycling depot, so to speak.
Basically, they were used for making cement. They were smashed into little pieces to repair roads, make foundations for walls or drainage pipes. In this building, they marked out small areas and built walls, stacking amphorae on top of each other and covering them with lime and cement at the end to give the wall stability. In several of them, they found amphorae stacked up 3 high, one on top of the other. So each area was definitely destined to sell the remains of the various amphorae.
The Romans were clearly very inventive when it came to recycling, and in passing, left behind a unique archive of ancient economic history.
Waste isn't a constant. Waste depends on the economics of each individual society, on what fits into the order of that society and what doesn't. And that changes over the millennia. It also changes from city to country, from young to old, so it is constantly being reassessed.
After the fall of the Roman Empire, regions north of the Alps began to gain political influence. In the Middle Ages, many new cities were founded, also in Switzerland. Around 1300 CE, Zurich was already quite a big city with 8,000 inhabitants. Roman achievements such as sewage systems and water-flush toilets had long been forgotten. The inhabitants of Zurich sometimes had to travel a long way to dispose of their waste, often through neighboring dwellings. This is because only those living furthest away from the street had direct access to the open cesspits located behind the rows of houses. From these ditches, the liquid waste ran off towards the Limmat River, while the solid waste lay around until it was collected by a farmer. Today, the cesspits have all but disappeared from Zurich's cityscape, most of them built over. But several have been preserved. Hidden behind inconspicuous doors in the center of the old town, they offer a glimpse of what life was like in the Middle Ages. Historian Martin Illy is an acknowledged expert in the history of cesspits.
This is the so-called Murer plan, the bird's-eye view map of the city of Zurich from the 16th century. You can see the Limmat, the mountain and the city over here. And you can see the layout, that there is always a cesspit in the middle a row of houses to the left, a row of houses to the right, and then an alleyway. And that's repeated along the entire bank of the Limmat River. These cesspits, or A-graben, were actually boundary ditches. They were a legally recognized part of the city's layout.
The German E-graben also implied that these were a permanent feature.
Over time, these ditches were also used as waste disposal centres or rubbish ditches. Latrines were built above the ditches, and then the faeces fell into them, and waste was disposed of there. That meant we wouldn't have walked around one of these ditches for long in the Middle Ages.
Some cesspits were later built over with concrete covers, but the ditches were preserved as they had been in the Middle Ages. One can only guess what the prevailing smell was like. There must have been heated arguments among the residents.
Of course, it stank quite a bit here, but the ditch was aired and the faeces were also mixed with straw. And as a result, the faeces decomposed very quickly. It actually turned into dung. You have to imagine that in the city it smelt more like farmland.
But even then, some people were more sensitive to odours than others. This meant disputes arose frequently, so-called privy disputes, which often ended up in court. In the court records of the city of Zurich from 1465, several of these are documented, such as this one.
The complaint is that Federli the barber accuses Ulrichen Ritter the tailor of an incident in which, as he was leaving one morning for early mass, said Ulrichen Ritter threw evil-smelling sewage out of his house upon him, such that he was no longer able to attend the church service, but instead was obliged to return home and change his clothing.
Well, it's much easier today. We just press the flush button or put the rubbish bag out onto the pavement, and the user's issue is basically solved. In the Middle Ages, this was of course different. The supply and the disposal had to be regulated.
Medieval waste disposal practices turned the dirt roads into stinking quagmires that could only be traversed dry-footed with high-heeled shoes, called trippen. Free-roaming pigs were welcomed as rubbish scavengers, but they created more dirt of their own. Most of it was trodden firmly into place, but this caused the road levels to rise, in some cases by several meters. When the roads were finally paved, stricter measures had to be taken. Henceforth, litterers were pilloried. Sometimes prostitutes had to clean the streets because they used the streets more than other respectable citizens. Sometimes prison inmates. Only when machines took over the job did tempers subside. It's more or less impossible for us today to reconstruct precisely the kind of rubbish that was produced in the Middle Ages. One exception is the rubbish that landed up in the latrines, the outhouses. A few of these located in the middle of Zurich's old town have been excavated. The contents were real treasure troves for archaeologists because the rubbish from back then is excellently preserved in the cesspits. These alone are the finds from a single latrine.
The special thing about the cesspits is that when they are closed, that is, when they are covered over with building rubble, no more air gets in. And that creates a humid environment and good preservation conditions, also for wood or other organic materials.
Apart from entire lavatory seats, rare leather shoes or glass was preserved, but above all, ceramic shards, which even if one was lucky, fitted together. In this way, the rubbish of the past was turned into valuable collector's items. In museums, these items tell us about the lives of our ancestors and, not least, about what they threw away. The focus on rubbish belies the fact that in the Middle Ages there was hardly any rubbish in the modern sense. They recycled everything they could. The historic paper mill in Basel bears witness to this too. Here, as in the Middle Ages, paper is still made from rags.
To keep a paper mill like the one we have here going, you need 40 kilograms of rags daily. That's really a very large quantity. One big basketful every day. And of course, the rags weren't as white then as they are today. They had the added charm of having been worn until they were completely unwearable.
The paper mill was supplied by so-called rag pickers.
Wait! I've got some more for you.
They pushed their carts through the streets, collecting everything that could be used for further processing. This included not only rags, but also skins, broken glass, metal for resmelting, and bones used for making glue or buttons. But first and foremost, it was rags for the paper industry.
The idea is that, like ripening cheese, you take bacteria from the last production and inoculate it until the whole thing is a big pile of mold. After 5 days, according to an old description, a small amount of a slimy matter rises to the surface. They describe how, on the 6th and 7th day, the heat is so intense that you can't put your hand in it. In the end, fungi grow on top, and when it looks like this, the result is the whitest and most beautiful paper, a miracle of alchemy. For me, that is one of the greatest wonders of papermaking.
And this is how it works. After rotting, the rags are soaked in water and lime and pounded to a pulp in a stamping mill. The thick mass is agitated, then scooped up with a wood-framed sieve, and then couched, as they call it in papermaking jargon. The mass is then transported to a press and is finally dried, sheet by sheet.
You could earn very good money with paper, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries. If you imagine that until about 1840, every scrap of paper had to be made from rags, and that is at a time when there were daily newspapers, when print shops produced an incredible amount of printed matter on high-speed presses, when school attendance was compulsory, when the administration, when everyone needed paper, and it all had to be made from rags, there was a tremendous shortage of raw materials, so the demand was proportionately high.
In the Middle Ages, rag picker was a recognized trade. They worked with raw materials that were very valuable.
In 1900, the tide turned because wood pulp was invented. Wood as a cheap raw material replaced rags, and so the importance of rags was lost. The image of the rag picker suffered, and that's what we actually know today. This negative image of the rag picker from the industrialization era.
In the 20th century, everything changed. The term rag picker came to epitomize life at the lowest levels of society, because as methods were developed to produce paper from wood, cheaply and in large quantities, the once profitable part of their wares became worthless. London, in modern times the first European city to break the 1 million mark. And in 1900, with nearly 6 million inhabitants, already the largest city in the world. Distances could scarcely be covered on foot any longer. Horse-drawn carriages were essential. They handled the transport of local passengers and all inner-city goods. Bakers, butchers, beer and coal merchants, police, fire brigade, ambulances, funeral parlours, all depended on horsepower. And so the number of horses in London grew to no fewer than 300,000 in 1900. The city's equestrian past is still evident today, as a look behind the stately facades reveals. The hidden side streets, called mews, where the city's many stables were located. A single stable today gives an indication of what became a serious problem at the end of the 19th century: the muck. Even though 2/3 of all horse droppings stayed in the stables, 1/3 was still deposited and left on the streets. Projected over 300,000 horses, that's 1,500 tons of horse manure landing on the streets of London a day, the equivalent of the weight of 200 double-decker buses, plus 1 million litres of urine every single day. Horse manure lay piled up several meters high in some areas, and this affected all the major cities of the time: London, Paris, and New York. There was even an international conference on the subject, because the dung attracted flies and parasites that could transmit typhoid. A remedy was needed fast. But then, the seemingly impossible problem was surprisingly solved by a new invention. Carriages, without horses but with engines, the first automobiles. They were held to be an absolutely environmentally friendly, clean means of transport, the greatest health-promoting invention of the last 1,000 years, as a journalist enthused in 1903. It was not only the horse manure on the streets that posed a health hazard, however. People in London lived cramped together in extremely close quarters. The hygiene conditions were catastrophic. Disease and related deaths were rampant. The number one disease was cholera. Epidemics were frequent and claimed tens of thousands of lives. The awful thing was, no one knew much about it. The fact that cholera could be transmitted by contaminated drinking water seemed absolutely ridiculous to most people. They clung to the age-old belief that the air was the carrier. And the air in London was truly awful. The prevailing stench was unbearable. One person who wanted to change this was engineer Joseph Bazalgette. He wanted to channel the sewage that was being discharged into the Thames out of the city by means of a sewage system, but his plan fell on deaf ears everywhere. The problem was evident in the silt of the Thames. The river rises and falls with the sea's tidal activity. Joseph Bazalgette's direct descendant, his great-great-grandson, Sir Peter Bazalgette, explains what the consequences were for London at that time.
The River Thames should have been the great artery of London, but instead it became a smelly, fetid, diseased, dark brown mess. There were cartoons in the newspapers of skeletons presiding over it because it was a place of death. It was a tidal river. It didn't flow fast enough for the rubbish to go. So the rubbish would go up that end, then come back again, and go back and forth, and more came in, and more, and back and forth, and more came in, and more came in. So unlike other rivers, which were faster flowing, it had a particular problem.
The river was one huge cesspit. At ebb tide, the waste disappeared briefly, only to be mercilessly swept back up into the city at high tide. In the record hot summer of 1858, the situation was especially bad. It went down in history as the Big Stink. Politicians in Westminster Palace soaked their curtains in chlorinated lime to protect themselves from cholera infection, but the stench was pervasive. It was the perfect time for Joseph Bazalgette to come forward once again with his idea.
This is a situation that needs a plan.
One of the things that stopped Joseph Bazalgette getting support for his plan was the sheer cost of it, because his plan was very, very ambitious. building all the sewers separate from the river, right across the city. Very, very ambitious, very expensive, and people did not want to spend the money. Does that not sound like today, when politicians do not want to spend money on infrastructure? Well, that was the same then.
But fear of their own mortality increased their willingness to compromise, or at least to listen.
Look, sir, I will show you a plan. You need to see.
Joseph Bazalgette's hour had come. The big stink paved the way for his plans. He finally got the green light to construct his gigantic sewage system. In just 8 years, he dug up the whole of London and created what was then the most advanced sewage system in the world. Large diameter pipes carried the sewage over a natural gradient 12 miles outside the city to pumping stations that pumped the material up from the depths into large retention basins, only discharging it into the Thames and the sea as the tide changed. The Crossness pumping station, built between 1865 and 1868, is nothing like what one might imagine a sewage pumping station to be. It is an architectural masterpiece, with magnificent ornamentation and spectacular Victorian cast ironwork that is more reminiscent of a palace than a pumping station.
Some people describe this place as a cathedral of sewage, and it is like a cathedral. It has 4 massive engines which were for pumping the sewage, and those 4 engines are named after the members of the royal family. What is their job? Pumping shit. Is this disrespectful? No. They were proud of their public works. They were proud of cleansing the city. They were proud of the sheer ambition of their scheme. Their son, Edward, came here and opened the new pumping station. He came down the river in a barge with the Archbishop of Canterbury and all the MPs from Parliament, and he had lunch in a building whose job was to pump shit.
Even though it would still take some time before the exact cause of cholera was discovered, after the introduction of the sewage system, the disease was contained and the mortality rate dropped rapidly. But not everyone benefited from the achievements of urban hygiene. The farmers were left high and dry. After the introduction of the alluvial sewage system, less and less fecal waste landed up on their fields. And more disturbing waste was found in the farmers' buckets.
Sewage systems were introduced in the metropolises of Europe in the 19th century as a result of cholera epidemics, and were certainly a great blessing for people living together in cramped tenement housing. What fell by the wayside was that the manure, the feces, had previously been collected and taken to the countryside as fertilizer to be reused by farmers. So it wasn't flushed away as it is today, but reused. And the fact that there was no fertilizer in the form of feces meant, of course, a loss, an economic loss for the farmers in the areas surrounding the large cities.
While chemical fertilizers would soon take over the function of human waste, it meant that the oldest method of fecal disposal, agricultural recycling, had had its day. For the other rubbish, cities would have to come up with a different plan. Then came a revolutionary idea to collect waste directly from people's homes. Initially using a wide variety of containers, so-called unsystematic waste collection, then in standardized bins with lids. This was the birth of today's dustbin and a milestone in the history of waste disposal.
People in the old days, up to the 19th century, had a fairly relaxed relationship with rubbish. But we shouldn't forget that in modern times, a process of civilization has taken place in which bans are increasingly imposed from above, which people then turn into self-imposed constraints. An increasing sense of shame developed. In the 20th century, rubbish was hidden in courtyards. The rubbish bins disappeared, and it was no longer visible. I think this is a process of civilization, of self-constraint, but it is also related to power structures.
With the start of industrial mass production, the volume of waste increased, and the disposal of it became a mammoth task. But this development was slowed down again by 2 world wars, especially the second. In 1945, Germany lay in ruins. The hardship and need of the people and the shortage of virtually everything changed people's views. Hardly anything was rubbish anymore. Every brick was valuable and turned into building material again. Gas masks were not simply thrown away. Butter dishes were made from the lower attachments. Army blankets and parachutes were turned into suits, dresses, and underwear. Even old army helmets found a second life as cooking pots, or were professionally revamped into colanders. Shortages created a new high point in the history of recycling. But all this came to an end as the economy gained momentum. After a period of austerity, people wanted to consume. They were mad to buy anything as long as it was new. Particularly popular was a very different material now flooding the shops, easily adaptable and so cheap that it didn't even need to be recycled. Almost anything could be made from it, from disposable packaging to practical utensils. A material made from a substance that did not occur in nature in this form, that was created by man. Plastic. The history of this artificial material began around 200,000 years ago. People produced birch pitch, a kind of all-purpose glue, from birch bark. Later, in South America, they made the first rubber boots and toys. In the Middle Ages, the milk protein casein was combined with lime to create the paint used to paint famous frescoes. However, the real breakthrough in plastics came in the 19th century when components of crude oil, natural gas, and chemicals were mixed together in varying novel combinations. Sometimes the discovery happened by chance. Sometimes it was the result of lengthy research. Whichever, there was always great excitement. Thousands of different kinds of plastics began to conquer the world in a very short time. And although they were so durable, they were thrown away in enormous quantities. Today, we live in a throwaway society, a society in which the amount of waste has almost become a gauge of economic power. Items are disposed of to stimulate the demand for new things, to increase a society's prosperity. The wealthier the country, the bigger the amount of rubbish per head of population. In Germany, in 2020, it was around 480 kilograms.
Today, the disposal of items takes priority over recycling, simply to keep the consumer society and new consumable items going. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. The moment we stop consuming, the system collapses. And that is why recycling is not in line with our social and economic order.
The first companies have realized that things cannot go on like this and are working against it. The city sanitation services in Hamburg, for example, whose employees pull things that are still usable out of the rubbish and take them back to a specially set up department store. This is an attempt to give things a new value, to keep the waste circulating, thereby conserving resources. But however praiseworthy such initiatives are, they're not even remotely adequate remedies for our problem. Rubbish has long gained the upper hand. A little recycling is not going to fix it. A rethink is needed.
We have developed a culture of waste and throw away rather than reuse. And the challenge we have today, and we are right in the middle of this now, we are trying to retrain our culture. Joseph Bazalgette would have been, like many engineers today are, trying to come up with solutions to this. But one of the solutions lies beyond the power of the engineer, and that is our own behavior. Our own behavior, and we have to change our behavior.
Plastics, in particular, have turned out to be a fatal invention. Because they cannot be decomposed by nature, they only break down into ever smaller particles whose full effects on ecosystems are not yet known. But plastic waste is already a real threat to biodiversity in the world's oceans. Rubbish is now found everywhere, in the water, on land, and even in space. There, even the smallest pieces of debris threaten satellites and even space stations as they travel at enormous speed. Wherever we humans go, we leave our rubbish behind us, and that hasn't changed since the Stone Age, when we knew no better. It's high time we humans got wise.